Have you ever needed to conditionally enforce a validation rule based on a particular user or profile? Or set different field defaults based on a profile? What about releasing a new feature to a subset of your users? In this video from 2018, Tami Lau is discussing hierarchical custom settings in Click and Code, which will support your learning journey in Salesforce. Welcome! It's Rachel and Jessica from 100 Days of Trailhead, the place where the tech community comes to learn Salesforce, learn tech, get inspired, have fun, and invest in ourselves. Whether you are brand new to learning Salesforce and starting from the beginning, or mid-career and skilling up for that new opportunity, we are your trail guides here to support you with an itinerary to help you get where you're going. You are in the right place. If you are new to our channel, make sure you hit the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to click on the notification bell so you can be notified when we release a new video. In the description below, you can find links on everything we mention in this video, in addition to links we find helpful like books that have helped us and our friends along our tech and Salesforce journeys. To find other helpful Salesforce and tech content, visit our blog at 100daysoftrailhead.com. In this video, Tami will discuss what a REST API is and when to use REST Web Services. Tami is a Salesforce developer at Presence Product Group by day and an Oakland user group leader, Rad Woman coach, and Amplify regional leader by night. She is a Salesforce MVP somewhere in between. She also makes a mean blueberry pie. Your quest, should you choose to take it, is to journey with us through the adventure of learning REST Web Services. Your quest begins now.
I wanted to come and talk about custom settings, which are one of my favorite things in Salesforce that I think is very underappreciated. And a lot of people I talk to don't know what they are or have never used them or have seen them and used them but don't really understand how they work. So I thought this is something I wanted to share with you all. So I am a Salesforce developer at a consulting company called Presence Product Group. I started my career in 2012, as Rachel mentioned, as an admin at a very small nonprofit where I was actually Convio administrator, the Razor's Edge Convio administrator, for those of you who know what this is. And I was actually brought in because they wanted me to help them integrate Salesforce with Convio. So I was the Convio expert. And I quickly realized Salesforce blew everything out of the water, and that's what I wanted to do instead of Convio. And so I took my admin exam. I started becoming basically the declarative developer there, configured the whole system, and then from there went on to Sierra Club, where I took a job as a programmer, and I say accidental architect because I sort of got thrown into a role where I started designing parts of the system, integrations, how the various pieces of the system work together, and it wasn't something I was intentionally doing. It just sort of became my job. But the thing I did very intentionally pursue was becoming a developer. So I'm a Rad Woman graduate. I went through the program in 2016 and fell in love with programming. And from there, just begged for as many jobs writing code as I could until just this past year, I took a job as a full-time developer at a consulting company. And we work with nonprofits and other social impact orgs to implement Salesforce. And I think that's it about me. So let's move on to the topic at hand, unless anyone has any questions at this stage. All right. So how many of you have ever seen a validation rule like this in your org? Something like, we want to make sure that industry is filled out or annual revenue is filled out, but we don't want to enforce that if the user is a system admin. So in this case, this user profile ID is for a system admin. So we hard code this in our validation rule to say, oh, make sure the user's profile ID is not this ID, which hopefully is system admin. Hard code ID, not great, but it gets the job done. Or something like this, where you have a workflow rule, but you don't want to fire it if it's a system admin. So you want to say, if the profile is not system admin, then you fire this rule. A little less bad than the hardcore ID, just because you can read it and you can look at it and know exactly what it's doing. Not so dependent on the ID, but still it is hard-coded in there. Or something like this in code, where you say, if the user's profile ID is not system admin, then run this code. Right? Hardcore ID, again, very, very bad, but gets the job done, right? So this is a very common way to sort of conditionally enforce validation rules or run workflows or run code in an org. And it works for the most part until you get to exception after exception after exception. Once you get to the point where you say, oh, it's not for system admins, and not for this integration user, and not for this other API user, and not for that other person. Oh, and also this profile. You can see where it gets to stack, where it gets to be pretty unmanageable. And you're looking at this and trying to figure out, exactly who it's running for and when, and it can get really complicated. And this is actually more complicated, but it's still pretty simple. It's still fairly easy to read, but it can get a lot worse than that. So what do we do about this? How do we clean all this up and make our org manageable? This is where hierarchical custom settings come in. So for those of you who have not heard of them, hierarchical custom settings are similar to custom objects, and they allow you to create custom data and settings for your app. What makes them special is that they have what's called hierarchical logic, and it lets you create settings for specific profiles and users, as well as a default for your org. And the magic of this is that what it does is when you check a hierarchical custom setting, it checks for the lowest level first. So it has that intelligence baked into it. And so it first checks to see if the user has the setting, and then it checks to see if the user's profile has a setting. And if it still doesn't find one, then it looks for the organization default. So your organization can always have a default. That's what the setting is. Then you tailor it down. What that means is, for example, you could say this profile has their setting, but this user within that profile has a different setting, right? And so it can really be a mix and match, which is really helpful. And then in all your formula fields and in your Apex, basically you would take all that hard-coded values that I showed before and replace it with one line to account for all of that variation. I think I'll have that there. But are there any questions so far before I move on to talking more about custom settings? I do have a screenshot where I show you what it looks like before and after, but this is the basics of what a hierarchical custom setting is.
We don't have any questions so far.
Great. So I just want to put a quick note in here that what I'm talking about is not a list custom setting, which is a different type of custom setting. And what a list custom setting provides is a reusable set of static data. And the key point there is that it does not vary by the user or the profile. It's available to everyone, and the values are the same for everyone. For the most part, custom metadata types have kind of replaced list custom settings, and Salesforce encourages you to use custom metadata types whenever you would consider using a list custom setting. But what I'm talking about, a hierarchical custom setting, I have a replacement. You're still good to go with those. Okay, so how do you create a custom setting? So in setup, I always type setting and get directly to it, but it would be under custom.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. If you are not speaking, can you please make sure that your mic is muted? We're hearing some background noise. Thank you. Tammy, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. All right, so in setup, under custom code, you would click on custom settings to get to the page. And then creating it looks like creating any other custom object. You give it a label with slightly fewer settings. You give it a label, you give it, has an API name, the setting type is hierarchy. Public, the visibility I'll talk about later, but it has to do with managed packages. And then best practice, give it a description so somebody else looking at it can understand what this means. So in this case, I've created a custom setting called organization settings, which controls validation rules, workflows, and triggers. And then within that custom setting object, you would create custom fields, just like you would on a regular custom object. So in this case, I've created a checkbox. It's called enforce validation rules. The default is false for this value. And then do as I say, not as I do, put in a description. Just pretend there's a description in here. All right, so pretend I've created these three. I've created checkboxes for enforcing validation rules, running triggers, and running workflows, which are the three examples I showed earlier. You would land on this page, which has the information about your custom setting object. And the key button here that is really easy to miss is the Manage button. That's how you would actually get to your custom setting records. If you hit Edit, that actually takes you to edit the custom setting object, the definition. But to get to the actual values, you would hit Manage. And then that'll take you to a list of all your custom settings where you can add, edit, or delete values. Okay, so before and after, the slide I promised. Before, I had this error condition that had 3 lines that was basically devoted to excluding certain users from enforcing this validation rule. That's all been replaced by 1 line that refers to my organization settings custom setting checkbox about whether or not to enforce these validation rules. All make sense so far? All right. So here, we're going to go to a live demo, and let's all pray to the demo gods. All right. Let's go to our custom setting. Can everyone see the screen okay? It's a good size.
Right. Yeah, we're good.
In custom
Zoom
setting.
in a little bit.
Zoom in a little?
Just a little bit, please. Thank you.
How's that?
Perfect.
Great. So let's go to my settings. So here's that exact screen I showed you. Almost. I had to delete the field in here since I took a screenshot. And let's go to manage our records. So you can see on this page, if you hit edit on this page, what you would do is you would edit your default organization values. In this case, I think my DevOrg company name is called Sierra Club because that's where I used to work. So that's why it says Sierra Club here. But if you hit edit, then you're editing your default values. So you can say by default, don't run these things. But in this case, I actually want the default to be to enforce everything, run everything. And what I actually want is for the system admin to conditionally don't enforce validation rules, don't run workflow rules. In this case, I said do run triggers, but you can easily edit to say I don't want to run triggers. Right. So let's go back to our list. So now we have everything turned off for sysadmins. But let's say there's one sysadmin that sort of doesn't, where you actually want some of these things to run. What you do is you create a new setting. I want it to be on the user. You would find the user, and you would say, actually, for this person, I want triggers to run. And you go back to the list, and you can see now there's 2 settings. There's one for the profile level, which is a sysadmin, which has everything turned off. And then there's one for me, who is a sysadmin, but I put in a setting for myself that's different than the profile setting. And what the code will do when it runs is it'll look at these settings, and it'll say, does the user have a setting? In this case, I'm the user. I do have a setting, so it uses those. If I didn't have one, it would look up to the profile, say, does this profile have a setting? If the profile has a setting, use that. If not, then go to the default, which is at the org level, and just use the default. All right, so now that we have these settings in place, how do we actually use them? Let's start by looking at a validation rule. Specifically, this one that says required industry or annual revenue, which had all this hard-coded logic in it. So instead of having all of this crazy stuff in it, you can just take that all out When you go to Insert Field, your custom settings will show up as a setup item. So here's my, well, not Dreamhouse setting, organization settings. So under $setup, each of your custom setting objects should be listed here. Then if you click on that, you'll see the different fields that are in your custom setting object. So in this case, I'm looking at a validation rule. You see it's a checkbox. I'm just going to hit Insert, and that is it. So now instead of all that hard-coded logic, I have one line that says, check this custom setting for whether or not I should enforce this. And then I'm going to hit Save. And that's it. It's very similar for a workflow rule. So if I hit Edit, I can take out the hard-coded stuff, go to my setup object, run workflow rules. And there it is. And then how does that look in code? So let's open up Dev Console.
We have a question. Are custom settings available in Process Builder?
They are. Let's see.
In the validation rule, do you need to specify whether the customer setting is true or false?
No, so what this does is this pulls the checkbox off of the custom setting. So it's either true or false. If you wanted it to be the opposite, so let's say I want to test the negative case. This will return either true or false. If I wanted the opposite, I could just put it. I think that works. So I would say if not run workflow rules, it's very mind-bending. But basically what this does is it returns a true or false from the setting, and then you can treat that as if you had a Boolean anywhere else.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, let's go to, I'm going to admit I am not a process builder expert. Let's see. Good one.
Thank you, Catherine and Michelle, for those questions.
All right, set conditions. And I think definitely seen it. I think it's here. Formula evaluates to true, and it's under global system variable. Setup. And what these show up as is the individual fields. So you don't get to the object first, but it shows the fields directly. So if I had one that was run process builder, I would just choose it from here. All right, and then in code, the way to access a custom setting, I have it commented here so I didn't have to copy and paste. You would instantiate an object of the setting. So you type in the name of the setting, give it a name, which can be anything you want. And then you type in the name of the setting again, and then there's 3 different ways to access this. So you can say get org defaults, which just gets the default for the org. It doesn't matter what the running user is, this will just get the defaults for the org. You can say get instance, and then here either put in a person's profile or user ID as a text string, and then that will get the values for that particular profile or user. Or you can use get instance and leave it blank, no parameters, and that's the magic that gets the lowest level setting. So it gets the user setting if there is one, otherwise it gets the profile setting, otherwise it gets the default. So this is the one I usually end up using because it gets the level that I want. but there is a way to get a specific level if you need to check something. And then what I do is I declare a Boolean, I call it run triggers, and then I just grab that field off of the user setting, which is the one I instantiated getting the lowest level. So if I take these two and move it up here, what I would do then is just take this Boolean and put it in here and replace the hard coded ID. So I'm saying if run triggers is true, then do this. So you could also probably shorten that to one line. Do this if you want to get fancy.
Catherine said, very cool.
Nice. So that's the shorthand fancy version. If you want to just do it all in one line. And we'll go ahead and save this. All right, so that's how you would use it in Apex. Let's see. So a couple other ways you can use it. I'll do some live demoing, which is always dangerous, but this will work. Just to prove that it works the way I said it works. Let's create a new custom setting. So you can use custom settings anywhere. You can use formula fields. The types of fields you can have is a little bit more limited. So you can't have like lookups or master detail or formulas, but for the sake of how you use these are pretty sufficient. Let's create a text field. I'm going to call it, let's see, default. What's a default? Why not? Let's see. Save this. So now I have a text field that's called default lead company. I'm planning to use this in a formula field as a default value. Let's go ahead and hit manage, and let's edit my setting. All right, so I've got that, and let's say for sysadmin, it's going to be Salesforce. And I'll leave it blank in that case. I just realized maybe I can't do this. Let's see. I don't normally work with leads. Can I put a default on this? Let's see. No, that's great. Okay, let's do it on something else. Let's say let's not use a standard field, huh? Let's create a new field. All right, so I'm creating a new text field just for the sake of ease. And what I'm going to do is in the default value field, I'm going to select my settings. Lead company. And let's leave it at that. All right. So now when I go to not set up, here's my new account. You can see it filled out my default here from my custom setting. And I can change it, but that kind of just fills it in by default. And the person doing it doesn't have to think about it. And you can use this in all sorts of ways. So I could have taken this value and then concatenated more stuff. I could have create a checkbox and then done a formula with a checkbox or a number or anything you can think of really with a formula field. The other cool thing I wanted to show, just a different use case for it, is for throwing error messages, which is a use case actually my coworker told me about that I thought was really cool. So let's go back to here and let's create a new field, checkbox, show full error message. Because how many times have you gotten a message that's like a stack trace and it's 1,000 characters and you have no idea what it means and you really don't want to show all your users that error message. So this is a way to show it conditionally based on the user. Shows full. And then let's go back to our manage, and it's unchecked by default, which is what I want. And for sysadmins, you want that checked. And here's the tricky part: is I checked it on sysadmins. I'm a sysadmin, but I have my own record, so I actually need to edit my own record as well. So let's say show there. All right. So then, how do we use this? We go back to Dev Console. Copy and paste that because I'm really lazy. And
you're efficient, not lazy.
Efficient, like that. I am very efficient. That's not the one I wanted. What is it? Actually, sure, why not? So you can see this is an Aura-enabled method, which means I can use it in Lightning components. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this whole thing in a try block catch, and I'm going to use my custom setting to determine what error message to show. So I'm going to say try. Let's paste this down here. Copy over it. I'm going to catch exceptions so if anything goes wrong. This again. What did I call this? Show full error message. All right, so that should give me a Boolean for whether or not to show the full error message. What I'm going to do is string error message equals, and if show full error is true, then I'm going to get the full message from the exception. But if it's false, I'm going to say, oops, something went wrong, because we don't really want to overwhelm the person with too much info. Please. All right, so that's my error message. And then I'm going to throw new Aura with this error message that is now conditional based on my custom setting. I hope that's correct. I usually use an IDE and it usually autofills, but I'm not going to demo this because I don't know where my Lightning component is that uses this. This is my regular dev org, so it's a bit of a mess. But you can see how the custom setting really allows you to do whatever you want that you can think of, as long as it involves text fields, booleans, numbers, phones, emails, any of those field types that I showed you. So any questions about anything I demoed before I go back to slides?
While people are putting in questions or potentially putting in questions, I just want to give you some of the feedback that we've been getting. Nikki's like, thanks, Tami. Very useful topic. She had to drop early, unfortunately. And Catherine was like, thanks, very cool. Michelle, she said, gotcha, thanks. And then she also said, great job. Nadina said, that's a cool feature. And Olga said, nope, mind blown. So that was great. And you are an expert with great knowledge. See, this is just a love fest. I love this group. You guys are awesome.
I'm not even done yet. So I just have a couple more slides. So where can you use these things? So Apex, which I showed you. Anywhere you can use a formula. So that's a lot of places. Custom button URLs, field defaults, flow formulas, formula fields, like that's kind of repetitive, but process builder, value chain rules, workflow field updates, probably a lot more places that use formulas. So anywhere you can use a formula, you can use this global setup object and access your custom settings and use those values. So some other use cases that I tried to think of, it's really anything that might be different that might be different based on the particular running user or the running user's profile, or you can set an org default. So some examples like different commission rates, to control automations and integrations, which is the biggest use case I had when I was doing this at Sierra Club, was whether or not to just to our outbound integration. IDs, tokens, URLs, default field values like I showed in the demo, field maximums and minimums. So anything you can think of, put in a formula field, you can put in a custom setting and control very easily. Just some notes on using them. They use the application cache, so they're very efficient. They won't slow you down. And retrieving them in Apex does not count towards your software limits. So just like custom metadata types, they do not count towards your limits. So that's a great thing. What they do count against is your custom object limit, because on the back end, they are a type of custom object. And that visibility setting that I showed you earlier, if you're putting a custom setting in a managed package, if you set the visibility of that private, then your subscribers won't be able to see, I believe, the values in the custom setting. So it hides it from your subscribers to some extent. So a great place to put things like tokens, like authorization tokens, client IDs, client secrets, anything that you want to package up and be able to make calls, but you don't want your subscribers to just grab those tokens. And then the other thing to note about these is they're visible to all admins, so there's no security on them per se, but they're visible to only admins. So if you have settings that you need a user to edit, like if you have a particular user that needs to go in and change them every once in a while, this is probably not a great place because they won't be able to see it. So just something to note. And in those cases, I've seen people use regular custom objects instead, which aren't as great in terms of SOQL and speed and things like that, but it does give you more flexibility in terms of security and who can edit them.
Alex does have a question. She asks, can you deploy custom settings via change set?
No. So more notes. These cannot be deployed. They act like regular object records, not custom metadata type records. So you can't migrate them with a change set, and they can't be deployed as part of a managed package. So a couple of ways around this, you can either manually recreate them if there's not very many. You could pull them down and I think re-import them using data loader if you have a lot. If you're doing a managed package, you can deploy using a post-install script to insert the records. Or the other option is what we do in Apex a lot is we actually wrap our custom settings in an Apex class, which returns default values if there's no default value set in the org, which is a good way to protect against null values. So we would have an Apex class that all it does is it accesses the custom values, and if the value is null, it returns a certain hard-coded value instead. So that's what we do in a lot of our orgs. But no, they cannot be deployed, unfortunately. And then because of that, if you're doing testing in Apex and you're depending on a certain custom setting value, you do need to create and insert insert that value. They are not available to you when you're running your Apex tests. You need to insert them just like regular S objects. Or if you use an Apex wrapper, you can grab the default value from there. But in a lot of ways, they act very similarly to regular custom objects. And you can't access them in Apex tests. You can't deploy them, things like that. A couple of links here with some resources. So I'll share out this deck in our chatter group to make sure you all have them. But I think that's all I had in terms of my slides. So are there any other questions I can try to answer? What is an S object? An S object, is a custom object, or a standard or custom object. So account, contact, lead, anything custom you might have created. They're referred to as S objects when you write Apex.
So in Apex tests, would you need to instantiate them, essentially create your test environment in the test class?
Yeah, so if you're trying to test for a particular condition, you would have to insert them first, as if you're inserting an S object, right? A regular object. And then when your code makes the call, you'll see those.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any other questions? You can come completely on mic, just like Olga. No? Well, if y'all think of some questions and everything as we are talking, feel free to ask.
I sorry, I didn't realize I was double muted. I do have a question. So custom object limits when it comes to custom settings confuses me a little bit. Is it the like the Tami Lau record that counts as one custom object, or is it the fact that you made a custom setting at all?
It's the fact that you made a custom setting at all. Okay. So my organization settings setting, which all that is one custom object.
Gotcha. There's a level above that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And then each record counts as a record in
right.
storage. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Tammy, you made mention that there were some advantages and disadvantages compared to using custom metadata types. Can you expand on that at all?
Sure. So that in particular was around list custom settings, which I didn't really talk about. But if you compare list custom settings to custom metadata types, the advantage of custom metadata type is you can migrate them with your change sets, so you don't have to insert them or manually recreate them, which is really nice. And you can access them in your unit tests, which is really great, so you don't have to make sure to create them and insert them, things like that. The disadvantage I've found is that you also then cannot create them in unit test with a custom metadata type. So if I needed a particular value and my org happens to not be in that state at the moment, I really can't test that piece of my code. Because let's say I have a checkbox and at the moment it's unchecked in my org. But if I have a chunk of code that tests when it's checked, I can't test that because in the org it's unchecked. Right? And there's no way I haven't found a way to be able to fake that. I guess you could put the whole thing in a wrapper. There's probably some complicated things you can do, but in terms of the most basic, with a custom setting, you can insert it and say this is true or this is false, and it's a condition. But in a custom metadata type, you can't. That said, custom metadata type seems to be the future of list custom settings. So whenever I can, I do try to use those. But there hasn't been there's not a custom metadata type for the hierarchical settings yet. Did that answer the question?
Yeah.
So in terms of the unit tests, when you're creating the records, you're just creating the records for the individual profile or the record for the individual user. The setting itself does exist and that's deployable, or is it not? Does everything have to be recreated?
For testing?
Yes, for testing.
Yeah, so for testing, what I usually do is I just create a value at the org level instead of any particular user, just because if there's no settings for a profile or user, it'll get the org level. But yeah, so if you're wanting to test a particular condition, you have to create that, and then that doesn't just like other objects that you create in tests, they don't persist in the org. They get rolled back at the end of the test. Cool.
Okay. All right. So Barbara Christian said that here's Jennifer's blog on using them in Process Builder too. So you might want to check that out. Let's see. We have Olga says someone has really loud background noise. So please, if you can, mute when you're not talking. Michelle Burrow said, I recently learned about using custom settings in this way. My org has used it mostly for validation rules. Each validation rule is a field on the custom setting. That way, there may be some validation rules that needs to be avoided for a user or a profile, but not all. So.
Yeah, I definitely at my last org, we had a managed package that had hundreds and hundreds of custom settings. Because the custom settings controlled validation rules, they controlled code, they controlled just tons of things, and everything was in a custom setting, so you could go in and very easily check and uncheck things without hunting down all the different pieces, which is really nice.
Yeah, I think this can be very, very useful for sure.
It's really great for my sanity.
Yeah, absolutely.
We used to have an integration that sent an outbound message to an integration appliance. But what would happen is in a sandbox, if it was trying to send this outbound message, the integration appliance would just freak out because then it would reach back to try to get a record of a certain ID that had been sent, and the record was not there. It's not in production, it's a sandbox record. And then it would just halt the integration appliance. It would not process anything else until we resolve this error. Really annoying. So what we had started doing was every time we create a new sandbox, we would just go through and uncheck all 20 workflow actions that sent an outbound message. Say, deactivate this, blah, 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 all 20 of them. Really annoying. And instead, what we ended up doing is migrating this to a custom setting to say send outbound messages or not. And all the workflow rules would just use this setting. So when you create a new sandbox, you just have one place to go and uncheck everything. 3 checkboxes, and you're done. It was fabulous. And it saved us a bunch of headache trying to figure out which, just because it was so complicated before to make sure it wasn't sending messages that sometimes people would just forget. Like they missed one workflow rule or whatever it was, and then the whole integration would freak out. It was not great.
This has been
Hey everybody.
really awesome.
This is Deb out of Seattle. Thank you so much for the presentation. I wondered, can you use custom settings in workflow email alerts for the email addresses that it sends from or sends to? That's a big pain point with us with sandboxes because everything copies down and then you have to go in and edit all of them so they send from a test address.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but let's.
It's not a formula, so I'm thinking maybe not, but I thought I'd see if anybody else has that same problem and they've solved it with maybe this.
I unfortunately don't see that as an option.
Okay.
The recipient type is a very defined list.
Yeah.
And I don't see a place to do that. I wonder if there is a way to use a custom setting to put the email into an email field. And use that email field in your alert.
Oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to take that one down. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Michelle Burrow said, I wish I'd learned this sooner. I've written so many lengthy validation rules and formulas. I'm excited to learn that these can be used in code, process builders, etc. And then she said to the next person, create an idea. I'll vote for it.
Anybody else have any questions? I know the longer we sit here, the more.
No questions, just a very big thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
And with that, we're at the end. Have you ever needed to conditionally enforce a validation rule based on a particular user or profile, set different field defaults based on a profile, or release a new feature to a subset of users? How could these tips help you in your Salesforce org? Are you using hierarchical custom settings now? What is your top tips for learning and using these? Comment below. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you've made it to this point, we want to take an opportunity to say thank you. Since you stayed with us, here's a bonus. Custom settings don't count against your SOCL governance limits. They are also easy to access since they are cached at an application level and accessible via their own interface. Thank you for spending time with us. Make sure you like this video. It helps a lot. Click subscribe and on the notification bell so you never miss another video. We also handpick these videos, which we recommend you watch next. You can talk to us on Instagram, Twitter, and on our website at 100daysoftrailhead.com, all of which are listed below. Thank you for learning with us, and we'll see you back tomorrow.